The street was noisy and lively. The city lived its life. Cars honked, people hurried about their business, and above it all reigned the chaos of a large metropolis. A young guy, about 20 years old, was walking with his head proudly raised, holding a poster firmly in his hands. On it was a picture of his idol, Snoop Dogg. The poster, a little wrinkled but still bright, was his treasure, a symbol of inspiration and hope. The guy was smiling, humming a line from his favorite song when he felt someone's piercing gaze on him. The loud sound of a police siren tore through the air, causing passers-by to freeze. A patrol car pulled up to the curb, and a stoutly built man in a uniform got out. The policeman, about 40 years old and cold-eyed, walked straight toward him. "Hey, you!" His voice sounded like he was used to orders. "Come here." The boy froze, not realizing what was happening. He looked around, but there was no one in sight but him. The policeman was obviously addressing him. "What's the matter, officer?" The boy tried to speak calmly, but a note of alarm slipped into his voice. "What's that in your hands?" the officer asked, pointing to the poster. "This? It's just a poster. I'm a big Snoop Dogg fan," the boy replied with a smile, holding the poster closer to him. The officer's eyes narrowed and his gaze became even more icy. "A poster? And you're just walking down the street with this, garbage?" He took a step forward, and the tension between them became palpable. "It's not trash," the boy objected sharply, feeling the anger boiling in his chest. The policeman looked at him as if he had said something sacrilegious. The passers-by began to stop, sensing that something wrong was brewing. The officer glared at the boy defiantly from head to toe, contempt and suspicion in his expression. "Do you have the papers?" he asked without changing his tone. "Why do I have to show you anything?" The boy tried to hold himself steady, but his breathing became heavy. The officer didn't answer, instead snatching the poster from the guy's hands with unexpected force. The crowd around him froze. "Hey, what are you doing?" The guy rushed to retrieve his treasure, but the officer had already started tearing him apart. The sound of tearing paper was deafening. The boy's pride and dignity seemed to be torn along with the poster. He stood in shock while the policeman threw the torn pieces on the ground as if they were just trash. "Go home, boy. You're inappropriate here," the officer said, turning away. But this day could not end in peace. The boy stared at the torn poster at his feet, rage and pain bubbling in his chest. In the crowd, someone pulled out a phone and started filming. The beginning of this story was already going around the world. The boy tried to gather his thoughts, but his heart was racing. He saw the pieces of his poster scattered on the asphalt like fragments of his pride. Time seemed to stand still, and the crowd around him only grew, as if they were all waiting for events to unfold. "ID," I said. The policeman's voice sounded harsh, like an order. The boy looked up. His hands trembled slightly, but he wasn't going to show fear. "Officer, I'm just taking a walk. This is my street as much as it is yours. I'm not trespassing." "Really?" The officer grinned and crossed his arms over his chest. His tone became even more contemptuous. "Are you one of those guys? Typical guys like you always say they haven't done anything until we find something interesting." "One of who?" the boy asked sharply, his voice trembling but with anger in it. "You know yourself." The officer took a step closer, leaning toward him. "Street hooligans, fans of that, what's his name? Snoop Dogg? I wouldn't be surprised if you just stole something or are hiding something in your pockets." The crowd began to chatter. People were pulling out their phones, recording every moment. The policeman saw this, but it only seemed to fuel his irritation. Are you serious? You're accusing me for no reason?" The boy's voice grew louder. He felt a cold sweat run down his back. The reason is your looks." The officer grinned faintly, glancing at his clothes, a simple t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers. "You know, too many people like you cause trouble." The crowd began to buzz indignantly. Someone shouted, "Hey, that's too much. He didn't do anything wrong." The officer turned sharply at the voice as if he were ready to direct his indignation at anyone now, but then he turned back to the boy. "Last time I'll ask. ID, or we'll go to the station and find out what you're hiding," he said coldly, pressing each word. The guy realized he had no choice. He slowly pulled out his wallet and pulled out his ID card. The officer snatched it out of his hands as if the guy had just handed him a gun. The policeman studied the document, deliberately slow. His face retained a mask of contempt, as if he had already decided that he was guilty. "What's up? Star of the streets? Are those real papers?" He gave the guy a hard look. "Of course they're real," he replied defiantly. But that didn't stop the officer. He walked around the guy like he was trying to find something. His eyes stopped on the pockets of his jeans. "Now, empty your pockets. Show me what you got in there," he commanded. "This is over the top." The guy was indignant, but the crowd cheered him on. "Are you serious?" someone shouted from the surroundings. "Shut up," the policeman shouted to the crowd. "If anyone else interferes, I'll have you all arrested for obstruction of justice." The guy, sensing that every second was only fueling the hostility, slowly raised his hands in a sign that he didn't want conflict, but his voice sounded firm. "You're humiliating me just because I'm black? Just because I have a poster of my idol?" The words were like a spark falling on dry grass. The crowd murmured even louder. The situation was getting more and more tense. The policeman stepped close to the boy, almost touching his face. "Black, white, green, I don't care. I'm doing my job. You're suspicious." The boy felt a fire flare up inside him. He couldn't believe that such things still happened in the modern world. But he knew that his every word and action now could be a turning point. "If that's your job, it's a disgrace. And I'm not afraid," he said, looking straight into the officer's eyes. The crowd froze. What would happen next? The situation could spiral out of control at any moment. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from and whether you have faced something similar in your life. We care about your opinions and your stories. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss out on the most interesting and exciting stories. As we continue. The policeman's gaze darkened. The crowd around them continued to grow, and the conversations grew louder and louder. The young man stood with his head held high, but inside he could feel the tension becoming almost unbearable. In his hands he still held a scrap of the poster, which the policeman had previously regarded with frank contempt. "This garbage?" The officer suddenly spoke loudly, raising the piece of poster so that everyone could see it. His voice was filled with sarcasm and mockery. "This is your pride right here? Some street criminal's poster? Snoop Dogg is not a criminal," the boy replied firmly, feeling a wave of rage rising inside him. "He is a symbol of freedom and the voice of those who fight for their place in this world." These words only made the officer angrier. He stepped forward, his face contorted with contempt. "Freedom? Voice? This idol glorifies drugs and crime, and you're just another fan who thinks he's allowed to do anything." The cop snatched the rest of the poster out of the guy's hands. The crowd gasped, and the guy instinctively reached for his treasure, But the officer was faster. With force, he tore the poster in half and then into even smaller pieces, throwing them to the ground as if they were just trash. "Here's your freedom," he shouted, throwing the pieces of paper at the boy's feet. The crowd around started to get noisy. People shouted indignantly, "This is too much. What's he doing? Where's the justice?" But the policeman paid no attention. He looked directly at the boy, waiting for his reaction, as if enjoying his power. "You think that poster means something?" he continued, mocking. "It's just paper, just like your dreams of equality. Do you think it will make your life better?" The boy stood motionless. His heart was beating so hard that he thought the people around him would hear him. But instead of retreating, he gathered his courage and answered, "You can tear the poster down, but you can't tear down what it means to me." The words were louder than they seemed at that moment. The crowd around him fell silent, and for a moment everyone stopped. "What did you say?" The officer stepped closer, his face even harder. "I said you can tear the poster down, but you won't change what it symbolizes." The policeman grinned, turning back to the crowd. "Did you hear that? We have a philosopher here." He stepped on the torn scraps of paper, defiantly pressing them to the pavement with his boot. "Here's your symbol. Now it's underfoot where it belongs." The crowd exploded with outrage. People shouted words of support to the guy, someone filmed on his phone, and others tried to enter into a dialogue with the officer. But the guy, despite his inner pain and anger, did not back down. "You think you're stronger than me? But I'm not. Strength isn't in form or power. It's the truth." These words did not go unnoticed. They began to penetrate the hearts of the people around them. The policeman, on the other hand, began to lose control. "Who the hell are you to tell me the truth?" His voice was getting louder, but now he sounded nervous. It wasn't just a scene of humiliation. It was a moment that everyone standing around saw. The cameras were pointed at the officer, and his actions were no longer just a localized conflict. They began to take on a broader resonance. The policeman did not know that these images had already started their journey on the internet. And there were consequences ahead of him that he could not have imagined. The crowd continued to thicken, as if magnetically drawn to this scene of humiliation. People pulled out their phones, pointing their cameras at the policeman and the young man who stood across from him, clenching his fists and trying to keep his composure. The whispers and outraged cries around them grew louder, becoming a growing rumble. "Did you see that? He tore up his poster. Just like that," whispered one of the bystanders. "That's too much. How can you do that?" Another voice supported it. The officer looked back at the crowd. His face was rigid, but there was something in his eyes that could be mistaken for slight concern. He wasn't used to having his actions questioned. "Everybody back," he shouted loudly. "This is police business. Get out of the way." But his order only fueled the fire. People started asking questions. "Why are you treating him like this? Why did you do it? You think you can do anything?" The young man stared at the policeman, trying to ignore the emotions simmering inside him. He was hurt and humiliated. The tattered poster he loved so much now lay under the officer's muddy boots. But it wasn't this that hurt him the most. It was the stares of those around him who saw his helplessness, his humiliation. The policeman turned back to the guy again, feeling himself losing control of the situation. The crowd was beginning to dictate the course of events, and that was not in his plans. "Do you want to be a hero?" he asked with a sneer, pointing at the cameras. "Do you think they'll help you? I just want you to leave me alone. the boy replied, his voice sounding confident despite the trembling in his hands. At peace? The officer laughed, but there was a fake tinge to his laughter. People like you always want to be left alone, until something really bad happens. Those words sounded like a blow. The crowd murmured even louder. "Are you serious?" shouted a young woman from the front row. "Are you accusing him now just because he is black?" "I'm doing my job," cut the officer off, his face reddening. "It's not a job, it's racist," the woman continued. Someone in the crowd started shouting, "Take his face off, let everyone see who he is." Phones went higher. Some people were already streaming what was happening live. The policeman felt panic begin to overwhelm him. He turned to his partners, but they were standing a little further away, clearly unwilling to interfere in a situation that threatened to turn into a scandal. The boy stepped forward, his voice trembling but sounding loud. "You want me to shut up? You want me to just walk away like nothing happened? But it's not gonna happen. People see what you're doing, and it's not just my poster anymore. It's more than that." These words rippled through the crowd. People began to applaud and shout words of encouragement. The officer stepped toward the boy, almost right up to him, and hissed, "You don't know who you're messing with. One step, and you'll regret it." The boy did not flinch. He saw that fear was now not in his heart, but in the officer's eyes. The cop felt the control slipping from his hands, and that only made him angrier. The crowd grew louder and louder. People were shouting, "Let him go! We're recording everything! It's going to the news!" At that moment, what the officer feared most happened. One of the eyewitnesses shouted out, "It's already online. Everyone can see what you're doing." The officer froze for a moment. He looked at the crowd, at the phones, at the guy in front of him. Tension hung in the air like red-hot metal. Anxious thoughts resounded in his head, but he still hoped he could save face. "Everyone disperse." His voice cut through the air. "That's an order." But no one moved. The situation was getting out of control, and this was just the beginning. The video began its journey the moment the first witness hit the publish button. Social media exploded. The video captured the moment the poster was torn, the humiliating words of the policeman, his contemptuous look, and the young fan's attempts to defend his dignity. "This is a real nightmare," users wrote. "Racism on our streets. How long will this continue?" Thousands of comments, reposts, and angry statements filled the internet. The video quickly became a trending topic and started to be shown on news channels. People around the world discussed how the officer had abused his power, humiliated a young man, and epitomized the entire system of injustice. Meanwhile, the video reached Snoop Dogg's team. They immediately forwarded it to the rapper himself, and the reaction was not long in coming. Snoop was sitting in his office when he was shown the clip. The laptop screen glowed, reflecting the scenes of humiliation in his eyes. He frowned more and more with each passing second. His usually calm and confident face was now expressing anger. "What the hell is this shit?" he muttered, clenching his fists. The clip ended with the guy standing firm despite everything the cop did. In that moment, Snoop saw not just a fan, but the voice of a generation he helped shape. "This guy, he's my man," the rapper said quietly, but his words were filled with rage. He leaned back, inhaling deeply, but the silence didn't last long. "Find him. Find this guy. I want to talk to him personally," he tossed to his aides. "What about the police?" one of them asked. Snoop looked at him with such determination that he understood immediately. "They'll be sorry they ever messed with us." A few hours later, the rapper recorded a video message. It began with a close-up of his face, which was a mixture of pain, anger, and determination. "It's me, Snoop Dogg, and I just saw something that really pissed me off," he began. "This guy you saw in the video, he was just standing there holding my poster, my symbol, and this cop." He paused to suppress his anger. This cop decided he had the right to not only tear it up, but to humiliate this young man. Snoop's voice was filled with power. "We will not be silent. I'm not going to let this go unnoticed. This guy's my brother, just like any of you who know what it means to fight for what's yours." The video message exploded online. Millions of people, including other celebrities, started reposting it. The fan support campaign gained momentum. People demanded justice. Hashtags like #Justice for the Fan and #Stop Racism Again flooded the internet. But Snoop didn't limit himself to just words. He decided to organize a press conference where he was going to tell about what was happening and demand punishment for the officer. Meanwhile, the policeman himself did not know what was coming. Waves of criticism had already begun to rain down on him. His name became known, and more people demanded that he be suspended. The guy, meanwhile, was in shock at how quickly things were progressing. He received a message from Snoop Dogg's team inviting him to meet. His heart was filled with mixed feelings: fear, excitement, and still bitter about what had happened. But he realized that he was no longer just a victim. He had become a symbol, and that meant the story was just beginning. When Snoop Dogg's video message surfaced online, it struck the public like lightning. The rapper was sitting at a massive table, wearing a black hoodie that read, "Equality for All." Behind him was a huge graffiti-style portrait, his own image, that looked like a call to action. His voice was firm, every word filled with pain, anger, and determination. "Brothers and sisters, today I saw something that can't just be left alone," Snoop began, his voice calm but menacingly confident. "Our brother, one of us, was humiliated in front of everyone. For what? For being a fan, for being proud of himself, for being black." He paused to let the audience realize the weight of his words. That policeman thought he could break us. He thought his power was above justice. But we will show him and everyone else that he is not. Snoop leaned closer to the camera. His eyes burned with rage. "I'm reaching out to all my fans, to everyone who feels the world has become unfair. It's time for action. We're not just standing behind this guy. We stand behind everyone who faces this every day." These words spread across the web at the speed of light. Fans started recording videos, shouting words of support. The comments under Snoop Dogg's post were filled with calls for justice and action. "We're with you, Snoop. This officer needs to answer for his actions. No more silence." A few hours later, the protests began. People took to the streets with placards. "Justice for the fan. Stop racism now. We stand with Snoop." In various American cities, crowds of Snoop Dogg fans gathered in front of police stations, chanting slogans against racism and police brutality. In Los Angeles, a particularly large number of people gathered. Street musicians played Snoop Dogg songs and big screens broadcast moments of his address. The atmosphere was tense but unifying. People came with families, with children. Young people were holding Snoop Dogg posters as a symbol of struggle. Meanwhile, the police were in the center of public attention. The video clip became international news. Journalists sought comment, and activists demanded that the officer be fired and investigated. The police department tried to contain the crisis, but the situation was already spiraling out of control. However, not all encounters remained peaceful. In one town, a group of protesters clashed with the police. People shouted, "How much longer do we have to put up with this? Racism must end." The policemen stood in full combat gear, their faces stern. This only added to the sense of injustice. News headlines carried alarming reports. Protests escalate, situation spiraling out of control, police silence raises more questions. All the while, Snoop Dogg continued to keep in touch with fans through social media. He posted posts, shared videos from protests, and supported those who took risks for justice. But behind the scenes, Snoop Dogg was cooking up something more. He assembled a team of lawyers and activists to push for not just an apology, but real change. The rapper knew this was bigger than just one incident. This was a battle for voices that had gone unheard for too long. A fan whose life was suddenly in the spotlight was preparing to meet his idol. He felt a mixture of excitement and fear, realizing that he was now a symbol for thousands of people. And behind the scenes, the officer whose actions led to this crisis was in isolation. His name and face were everywhere, from the news to memes. He already realized that the situation was becoming too big to be hushed up. But this story was just getting started. Snoop Dogg promised that the truth would come out, and he never broke his promises. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether you have faced something similar in your life. It's important for us to know how you feel about these situations, and we're always happy to read your stories. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now so you don't miss out on new episodes. We really appreciate each and every one of you. Your support is incredibly important to us. And here we go. Events have been unfolding rapidly. Every minute brought new video footage, commentary, and reports on the incident. Crowds of protesters did not disperse, despite police attempts to quell the outrage. Stations across the country were besieged by public anger. People demanded justice and answers for the officers' actions. The police department of the city where the incident occurred was at the center of the storm. An official spokesperson came on the screens, trying to calm the public. "We have launched an internal investigation into the incident involving our employee," he said, his voice firm but tense. "We urge everyone to remain calm and refrain from jumping to conclusions." These words sounded like an empty formality. The crowd in front of the station reacted with furious noise, shouting accusations of trying to hush things up. "An investigation? We saw everything with our own eyes," shouted one of the protesters. "This is not an investigation, but a defense of a racist," echoed others. Meanwhile, the officer who had become the object of everyone's hatred sat at home, locking his doors and windows. Messages and calls came repeatedly to his phone. Some were supportive, but most contained threats. The internet had turned him into a symbol of all that is hated in the system. "You've ruined your life forever," one message read. "Too bad the cameras didn't capture your whole investigation." "We see who you really are," another user wrote. The officer stared at the phone screen, sweaty palms clenching the device. It was clear to him that his career hung in the balance, and even if the police tried to protect him, public opinion had already decided everything for them. Inside the department, the situation was even more tense. High-ranking officials were meeting in emergency sessions, trying to find a way to deal with the crisis. Some insisted on sacrificing an officer to preserve the department's reputation. Others resisted, arguing that doing so would open the door to dangerous precedents. "If we turn him in, we're admitting he's guilty," said one of the executives. it will hit the whole system. But if we defend it, we'll be eaten alive, objected another. Meanwhile, the protests continued to intensify. The crowds shouted louder and louder. People demanded action. Fire him! Justice for all! Stop covering for your own! But tensions were also rising among the protesters. At one of the rallies, there was a clash between a group of protesters and police officers who tried to disperse the rally. Tear gas and batons were used. A video of the clash instantly went viral on the internet, intensifying the wave of anger. They're using violence again. The headlines on the news were blaring. These events have added even more pressure on management. In the midst of all this chaos, the policeman himself began to realize the gravity of his actions. He could not leave the house without being met with judgmental stares or risk of attack. His name became known in every corner of the country, and he received threatening letters. His wife, crying and frightened, tried to persuade him to get help. You can't just sit around and wait for it to go away. It's not going to end, she said. They want me to admit I'm a racist. But I was just doing my job, he shouted, not knowing whether he was convincing her or himself. But even his own words sounded unconvincing. He remembered tearing up the poster, looking down at the guy. The realization began to creep in that he'd gone too far. Meanwhile, on social media, anti-racism hashtags were gaining millions of mentions. People posted their stories of injustice, racism, and police brutality. Each one reinforced public anger. Snoop Dogg continued to perform, posting video messages on social media. They think it's just another case, but it's not. We're not going to let it go. This officer is a symptom of a disease, and we will fight it to the end. These words sounded like a call to action. The pressure on the police department had become unbearable. They realized they could no longer ignore what had happened. They decided to go public and announce the officer's suspension pending an investigation. But it was clear to everyone. This was just the beginning. The officer was on the brink. His world was beginning to crumble, and he realized what might follow, and the public was preparing to move on, demanding not only dismissal, but real accountability. The story was just gaining momentum. The sun was already setting, casting a warm golden glow over the city as the Snoop Dogg fan stood in front of the door of a luxurious mansion surrounded by tall iron gates and greenery. He still couldn't believe he was here. The events of the last few days had turned his life upside down. From a simple poster boy, he had suddenly become the center of attention of the whole country. And now he was about to meet the man who had inspired him since childhood. The gate slowly opened, and the fan was invited inside. His heart was pounding so hard, it felt as if it could be heard. As he walked through the spacious courtyard, he tried to keep his hands from trembling. He was scared and excited at the same time. He felt a great responsibility to the millions of people who supported him. Each step seemed heavier than the last until he finally found himself in front of a massive wooden door that opened slowly. Inside, he was met by Snoop Dogg himself. The rapper wore simple but stylish clothes, a black tracksuit with gold inserts that cast glare on the walls. His face expressed a mixture of seriousness and warmth. He stepped forward and held out his hand. "You're the guy who started this whole thing," Snoop said, his deep voice sounding soft but confident. Fan smiled embarrassedly and squeezed his hand. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Snoop seemed to realize this. "Relax, brother. You're home. You're among your own," he added, patting the boy on the shoulder in a friendly manner. They sat down in the spacious living room, where the walls were hung with photos and awards that captured the highlights of Snoop Dogg's career. The boy looked at them with admiration, but Snoop quickly turned his attention back to himself. "Look, I saw that video. I saw that cop trying to humiliate you. But the way you hung in there, it was powerful. You inspired a lot of people without even realizing it," the rapper said. The boy felt his breath catch. He had expected support, but to hear such words from his idol was unbelievable. "I just couldn't keep quiet," he said finally. "It was wrong, but I didn't think it would go this far." "It's people like that who change the world," Snoop replied, his eyes burning with confidence. "You took a step that many people are afraid to take, and now it's my turn to support you." Snoop stood up and pulled a large poster from the closet with his autograph on it. It read, "For my brother who isn't afraid of the truth, Snoop Dogg." He handed it to the guy, who accepted the gift with awe. But the meeting didn't end there. "I got something else for you," the rapper said, gesturing for the guy to follow him. They went out into the courtyard, where members of Snoop Dogg's team were already waiting for them. On a big screen installed in the center, they started showing video messages from people all over the world who supported the guy. Many of them were filmed in poor neighborhoods where people faced injustice and racism on a daily basis. These words of gratitude and admiration brought the boy to tears. "It's not just your fight, it's our fight," Snoop said, "and we won't leave you alone." He then invited the guy to participate in his next show. Not just as an audience member, but as a guest who would come on stage and tell his story. It was to be a powerful message of unity and the power of truth. The fan was confused at first. He had never performed in front of such large audiences, but Snoop calmed him down. "You've already done the hard part. You didn't break. Everything else is just another step forward," he said. When the meeting came to an end, Snoop walked him to the exit and said one last thing. "If you need anything, I'm always here for you. We're of the same blood, brother." The boy left the mansion with a feeling that was hard to describe. He felt a support he had never known before and realized that he now had a mission. He was no longer just a victim of injustice. He was now a voice for those who could not speak, and there was more ahead of him than he could have ever imagined. The officer's name was now known throughout the country. It was in the news, in the headlines of articles, and accompanied by outraged comments on social networks. Each new publication about him only aggravated his situation. People on both sides of the barricades argued about what had happened, but the overwhelming majority had already made up their minds. He was guilty. The footage of him ripping up a Snoop Dogg fan's poster, his mocking tone, the contempt in his voice, the look on his face that was now the face of an entire unjust system, became the symbol of that guilt. The policeman woke up every day in a cold sweat. His home, once cozy and protected, had become a cage. The windows were closed with thick curtains. The doors were locked. The mailbox was full of letters, many of which he was afraid to open. Some were threatening, some were judgmental, and some contained pictures of him crossed out with a red line. One night, the phone rang. He'd been getting calls for a long time, only from people who wanted to remind him that his life would never be the same. He hesitated, but answered it. "Are you still here?" a man's voice said. "You better run, because when we find you—" The policeman dropped the call abruptly, his hands shaking. Even in his own home, he did not feel safe. His wife, sitting in the next room, watched in horror as her husband sank into an abyss of fear and despair. "We can't live like this." She finally couldn't take it anymore. You have to do something. You have to apologize. Apologize, he exploded, rising from his chair. For what? I was doing my job. They're the ones who made a big deal out of this show. This guy, this Snoop Dogg, they made me the enemy. But even he no longer believed his own words. His words seemed a pathetic attempt to cling to the remnants of his pride. Deep down, he realized the situation was out of control. Meanwhile, the protests continued unabated. Crowds continued to take to the streets demanding his dismissal and justice. They held placards reading, "Racism must not go unpunished," "Every officer must be held accountable for his actions," and "Down with the system of oppression." Some of these placards contained his name, in red lettering, next to accusations of racism. The media didn't lag behind. Talk shows discussed his actions, invited racial experts and activists who were not shy about calling him the face of the entire discriminatory system. This officer is not just a man. He is a symbol of how far the police system has gone in its aggression against minorities, said one of the participants in the debate. His superiors, who initially tried to keep the case quiet, could no longer ignore what was happening. Under public pressure, they issued a statement that was another blow to the police officer. At this time, the officer has been suspended while the investigation continues. We recognize the importance of transparency and fairness in this process. The news spread quickly. The suspension, though temporary, was seen by many as a victory. But it was not enough. People demanded a trial, dismissal, and real punishment. The policeman watched it all through the television screen. Each new report seemed to bring him closer to the edge of the abyss. He realized his career was ruined. No one would want to hire an officer with that kind of baggage. His colleagues kept their distance, fearing that endorsing him would damage their own reputations. One day, he went outside, hoping to buy some food. There didn't seem to be a soul around his house, but he felt that he was being watched. And indeed, after a few minutes, he heard a sharp voice behind him. "Hey, it's you. You think we forgot?" When he turned around, he saw a group of young men. Their faces expressed a mixture of rage and contempt. They approached, surrounding him like a pack of wolves. "Did you think we wouldn't notice? Did you think you could just walk away from this?" One of them said, his voice menacing. I was just doing my job." The policeman tried to justify himself, but his voice sounded pathetic. "That's not work, it's oppression," shouted another. The crowd was closing in and the officer realized he had nowhere to run. He hastened to escape, but the encounter left a deep imprint on his already shattered psyche. In those days, he began to realize that his name had become synonymous with injustice. He was mentioned in the news as an example of abuse of power. His image was printed on posters. The whole world seemed united against him. Although he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, he already felt that it would be impossible to go back to his old life. Every mistake leaves a mark, but his act had scarred not only him, but the entire system he represented. The night of the big concert had arrived. The stage in the middle of the huge stadium was glowing with lights, and thousands of people were gathered in the stands. The whole atmosphere was saturated with energy. It was not just a night of music, it was a movement. People came not only for the music, but also to show the world that the fight against injustice united them. Artists were already on stage, telling stories of struggle and hope through their songs. But the highlight of the evening was still to come. The audience knew that this concert was more than just entertainment. It became a symbol of resistance and a call for change. Backstage, Snoop Dogg was preparing for his performance. He was dressed in black, his shirt emblazoned with "Justice for All." His team had prepared everything down to the smallest detail, and he knew this moment had to be special. After all, it wasn't just his voice, it was the voice of everyone who had ever suffered injustice. Along with him, backstage was a young fan who had become the face of this fight. The guy still couldn't believe he was here. Just a few weeks ago, he was just a fan with a poster, and now his story was inspiring millions. But in the back of his mind, he still felt the weight of the humiliation he had experienced on the street. "Are you ready?" Snoop asked, turning to him. His voice was soft, but there was strength in it. "I don't know if I can," the boy answered honestly. "I'm just an ordinary person. What can I say to all these people?" Snoop put a hand on his shoulder and looked straight into his eyes. "You're not just an ordinary person. You're a symbol. You have proven that even those without power can stand up for their truth. And tonight, you will remind everyone that every voice counts." The auditorium fell silent as the stage lights dimmed. At that moment, a recording began, playing the words of the video messages of the victims of racism. Their voices echoed around the stadium, each one a reminder of an injustice that cannot be ignored. Then Snoop Dogg appeared on stage. "We are here today to tell the truth," he began, his voice booming like thunder. "We are here to say that racism and hatred have no place in our world." The hall exploded with applause. Snoop raised his hand, calling for silence. "But this night is not about me. It's about all of us. It's about reminding everyone who has ever been humiliated, everyone who has faced injustice. We see you. We are with you, and we will not stop." He turned to the backstage area, and the guy took a step forward. The crowd greeted him with deafening screams. He stood, feeling a shiver go through his body, but the look of Snoop Dogg, full of confidence, gave him strength. The guy took the microphone. "I never thought I'd end up here," he began, and his voice trembled. "But I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because each of us has the right to be respected. Each of us has a right to be heard." His words drew a flurry of applause. "When I was stopped on the street, I was just a poster boy. They thought they could humiliate me because I looked a certain way. But I'm here to say, we can't be broken." His voice grew firmer with each word, and the crowd cheered louder and louder. "We're all here for one thing, to let the world know that we are equal, and no one can silence us." The stage lit up with bright lights as he finished. Snoop Dogg walked up to him, hugged him, and held his hand up in the air like a winner. That moment was forever etched in the memory of everyone who was in the stadium or watching the broadcast around the world. But it wasn't just a show. Snoop Dogg announced that all proceeds from the concert would go to support anti-racism and police reform programs. This news caused a new explosion of excitement. The next day, the newspapers blazed with headlines like, "The voice of justice is louder than ever," "Snoop Dogg and a fan turned pain into a movement," and "A lesson the world will never forget." A reckoning awaited the police officer who was at the center of this story. His name became forever associated with shame, and the system he represented was forced to begin to change. People were no longer afraid to speak out, and that became the greatest triumph of all. This concert was not just a lesson, but the beginning of a new era. History has shown that truth and dignity can defeat even the strongest obstacles, and this victory belonged to everyone who found the strength to fight. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? We want to know what you think, because each of you is incredibly important to us. We appreciate each of you and your support. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel and give us a like so you don't miss new stories. We wish you a good day and justice in every situation.